In today's video, we are sewing design number 5, which is tartan lines. Being from Scotland, there was no way that I could do this series without including tartan lines. It's fun, it's easy, it's fast, and it builds on design number 4, grids for days. So let's dive in. Hi, I'm Tom and I'm the Colourblind Quilter, and you are watching my series, This Is How You Quilt It. We're making a flip book of 21 all over quick and easy quilting designs. Try saying that 10 times fast. And this is going to give you lots of choices when it comes to picking a quilting design for your quilt. But rather than just showing you the steps how to prep and sew this, I actually want to show you example quilts that have been mocked up using these quilting designs. And this can help you to visualize what's possible. I think that some of the fear that we have when it comes to quilting a project is not knowing what the finished product will look like. So I'm aiming to help you get over that by showing you these example quilts. If you are just starting out in this series, welcome and thank you for joining us. There is a free worksheet in the description below that has all the supplies and the prep to do for sewing all these samples. There's also a link to the playlist in the corner and in the description so that you can catch up on all the previous videos and get yourself up to date. And remember, stick around to the end of this video so you can see those example quilts that I was telling you about. So let's get started. So yes, it's a fun, lovely design and it's based on Scottish tartan fabric. And you can see these lines in the tartan and where this design gets its inspiration from. If you have a quilt where your blocks are sashed, this is a fantastic design to use because you can put these groups of lines into the sashing and it will really frame your blocks beautifully. Or alternatively, you can run it through the middle of blocks to create designs in negative space as well, and I have an example of that coming up. This will work equally well for square quilts or rectangular quilts, and you just need to adjust your lines accordingly. The difficulty rating on this is a 2 out of 5, so it's not too difficult at all. The cuddle rating is a 3 out of 5. And that's because of the grouped lines. They can make the quilt feel just a little bit denser, but depending on how far apart those lines are, it can be softer or fluffier. So just bear that in mind when you're picking this design. So let's look at the prep steps for this, and this is so simple. So to begin the prep for this, we are going to draw our initial lines. My lines are spaced 2 inches apart, which gives me 4 lines across my 10-inch block. When it comes to deciding the distance between these initial lines, you want to make sure that you have symmetry on the left and right side, and that is very important with this design. To figure that out, what you want to do is take the width of your quilt or the sample and divide it by the distance of the lines. So 10 divided by 2 gives me 4 lines, which will give me symmetry on the left and right edges. If I had got 4.2, that would mean I would have a weird gap on the right hand side, so I would just adjust that distance accordingly. So use the top and bottom edge of the sample as well as the left edge and mark your lines, keeping them as straight as possible by using all the lines and all the guides on your ruler. Once we've done that, I am adding a second line to the right of the lines that we just drew, and I'm putting that a 1/4 inch away from the first line. And I mark all the lines to the right first. When I get to the end, I flip the block around 180 degrees, and then I mark all the lines again to the right. And that will give me 4 groups of 3 lines. Now, rotate your block 90 degrees and we are going to repeat the process. If you want a cheat step here and you have a 1/4 inch guide on your walking foot or your sewing foot, you can just mark your initial lines horizontally and vertically and then use the guide on your walking foot. And I will show you that during the sewing steps. Okay, so let's see how to sew this. And this is very similar to straight lines and grids for days. Find the line closest to the center and sew from the top to the bottom. Then rotate 90 degrees and find another line closest to the center and then sew from the top to the bottom. At this point, if you're using pins, you can remove them as your sample is secure. Now we are going to sew all the lines from that central line to the right edge, and you sew from top to bottom, cut threads and then keep going. And then once you reach the right edge, you want to pivot 180 degrees and then start sewing again from the center out until you have covered all the lines to the right edge. Then you're going to sew all your lines from top to bottom. Now, if you wanted to get away with only drawing the lines horizontally and lines vertically, as I mentioned, if you have a 1/4 inch guide on your foot, you can use that. What to do is to sew the marked guidelines first, then go back, align the sewn line with the 1/4 inch mark on your walking foot or your normal sewing foot, and then sew down. And then keep using the 1/4 inch guide on your foot, aligned with the sewing line, and this can save you a little bit of time if you don't want to draw lots of lines. Be aware that this can be slightly harder because you are having to sew straight, you're not following a guideline, so this can be a great way to develop your straight sewing skills. If you don't feel comfortable doing it like that though, by all means mark all the lines that you need and just follow them. Now, some things to watch out for here. When you are marking these lines, if you are using a pencil, having a sharp point on the pencil will give you a nice, fine, accurate line. When my pencil gets a little bit blunt, the lines get thicker, and so when I sew, I have to try and sew down the middle of the line, and then there is room for the lines to go a little bit wobbly. So the sharper the point, the finer the line, the straighter the line. If you want to save thread, instead of cutting threads at the bottom when you're sewing these groups of 3 lines, you can pivot, sew along the very edge of the quilt, and then pivot again and sew down the next line, and this will allow you to sew these lines without cutting thread. Make sure though that the travelling lines along the edge of the block are within the distance that your binding will cover. A variation of this is plaid. It is the same design, but it misses the middle line out of each of the groups, so it's groups of 2 lines as opposed to groups of 3 lines. So what you could do is, when it comes to sewing this, is you can mark all your lines out, but just skip the middle lines and only sew the lines that are 1/4 inch apart from each side. Very importantly though, when you are deciding on the distance for your initial lines, you need to form a square grid with your lines so that it emulates the tartan design, otherwise it's not quite tartan. Also, make sure to check how far apart you can quilt your batting and then space your lines accordingly. You may find that if you have your groups of lines quite far apart, that you actually have to add additional lines which travel down the middle between 2 groups of lines, just to make sure that your batting is secure. And also, when you are sewing, feel free to use a securing stitch function if you like. Now let's take a look at some example quilts and show you what's possible. Our first example quilt is a rail fence quilt. Now, I have used this example to show you that I haven't done the obvious with this, which would be putting the groups of line in between the blocks in the sashing. Instead, what I've done with this, I have put the lines so that they intersect through the blocks. So you can see vertically the 3 lines intersect down the middle of each rail fence block, and horizontally they intersect right through the middle of the block along that seam line. Now you can see that this creates a cross when it is cutting up parts of the rail fence blocks and the sashing, so it creates different secondary patterns throughout the quilt based on the way that it cuts it up. And I wanted to show you this because this quilt would have been the obvious choice to put the quilting in the sashing, but I wanted to show you what it would look like to do something a little bit different with this. This would still look great though, putting the groups of lines in the sashing. Now, example 2 is a square in a square quilt. Now this is a little bit more densely quilted, and what I have done is I have added 3 groups of lines within each square in the square block. Now, I like this for a couple of different reasons. Firstly, I like the fact that it divides the block up quite nicely. Secondly, I like the fact that the groups of lines create what feels like a frame around the outside of each square in the square block. Thirdly, in the sashing on the corners of each square in the square block, I feel like that creates a very cool looking little pattern there. And I think if I had put cornerstones, that would really highlight the cornerstones very nicely in that area. As you can see, it's symmetrical, which means that the top, bottom, left and right edges are all the same. But I think this looks very nice doing it this way. It creates lots of movement to the squares and it actually creates a secondary pattern of more squares inside the square in the square blocks by cutting the blocks up into little squares. So this is fun. I really like this and enjoy this quilt design. Next up is a bit special. This is my favorite Carpenter's Star quilt design. Now, there are many ways that you could put this quilting design into this quilt. However, I have chosen to start with a group of 3 lines horizontally and vertically right through the middle of the quilt. Now that flows down those seams and cuts the block into 4 quadrants. Then from there, I've made sure that the middle line of each group of 3 lines is intersecting down a seam. And what it does is it creates lots of squares that cut this up. So you can see if you look in the center how that star, it creates 4 squares which frame part of the half square triangle blocks that make up that star. I really enjoy this. I really think this looks absolutely brilliant. It's symmetrical, top, bottom, left and right sides are all the same. It works perfectly. And you can see how it creates texture through the negative space in the background color. I really do like this, and when I make a carpenter's star, I will definitely be using this design to quilt it. This again is a little bit dense, but it would depend on the size of the carpenter's star. You know, if this was a 100-inch square quilt, then these lines would be pretty far apart. But if this was only a 16-inch sample star, this would be a very densely quilted quilt. But I would think it would hang very flat if it was a wall hanging. But I really like this. I really love how it chops the star up. It's really cool. Love it. Our final example is a little bit special as well. I took the quilt example that was on point from the previous design to show you what you could do with an on point quilt. Now just to remind you, this is a 25 square checkerboard block with background squares set on point. Now when it came to designing this, my initial thought was to have them on the corners of the squares. But actually, on reflection, what I thought would look better was to put the groups of 3 lines right down the middle vertically of each of the columns. And then horizontally, what made sense was to put it through that gap in the middle to create a little bit more effect through the background squares. And then you can see in the top and the bottom edges, just to keep it symmetrical and to keep the square pattern forming, I added groups of lines that intersected through the points of the top and bottom row. Now I really like this, and I think this adds vertical and horizontal movement to a quilt that's on point, and I like how it actually frames each of these blocks. It creates secondary patterns in the background squares, and it creates secondary patterns through the on point blocks, and I think that this would be a very nice design to use for this type of quilt. Now just as an example as well, I mentioned that you would have to check the batting that you're using and how far apart you could quilt it. And so with this design, what you can see I've done is in between each of the blocks horizontally, I have added a line that is right down the middle of where the 2 points touch. And this would be an example of what you could do if your batting wouldn't allow you to quilt them that far apart. You could add extra lines like this just to make sure that you weren't going to have any movement in the batting of the quilt once you were finished quilting it. You can see the same thing as well. I have added horizontal lines that intersect right through the middle of the blocks. Again, there's symmetry left and right, top and bottom, and it works very nicely with design. So if you're doing an on-point quilt like this, highly suggest that you give this design a try. And that was our example quilts, and I hope you like them. So that was the tartan lines design, and those were the example quilts that I quilted using it. And I really hope you found it helpful seeing what was possible with this design. Don't forget, there is going to be a book that will be accompanying this video series, and it will have all of these 21 quilting designs with step-by-step instructions and diagrams, as well as 9 more designs that won't be in this video series. And I'll be packing it full of example quilts and lots of information to help you with the quilting process. So if you want to get notified when that comes out, make sure that you sign up to the mailing list using the description below. As you're sewing along, I'd love for you to share your progress on Instagram using the hashtag #ThisIsHowYouQuiltIt and tag me, the colorblind quilter, so that I can follow along and see all the samples that you're sewing. In the next video, we are going to be venturing into angles, and we are going to be sewing the crosshatch grid. If you find this video helpful, please do click the like button, make sure you're subscribed and you have clicked the bell so you'll get notified when the next video in this series comes out. And until next time, take care.